I've unrolled the map again. The same map I showed you last time. Old parchment, the colour of things that have been handled many times, and in many kinds of light. Amber at the edges where the years have worked on it, fading toward ivory at the centre. The ink dark in places, faint in others. The hand that drew it sometimes certain and sometimes guessing. It shows a world that resembles our own, the broad shapes of continents, the suggestion of oceans, coastlines that almost match the ones on any modern atlas, and yet do not quite. And the cities, marked in careful ink, each one named, that appear on no atlas I have ever opened. Cities that no road leads to, cities that no coordinate will find, cities that exist, it seems, only here, on this parchment, in this ink, in this particular quality of old and patient light. I keep coming back to this map. Each time I return to it, I find myself looking at a different part of it, different coastlines, different cities, a different story waiting in the ink. Last time, I brought you to the cities the water took. We stood at the edge of Atlantis and felt the particular grief of a civilization that forgot what it was for. The divine blood thinning across generations until what had been magnificent became merely powerful. And then the sea came. We listened for the bells of Veneta, still ringing somewhere beneath the cold grey Baltic, marking the hours of a city that no longer needs to mark ours. We followed Dahut to the shore of Yis and watched the gate open and the Atlantic pour through, and wondered, as I always wonder when I come to that story, whether she was truly the villain the centuries made her, or something older and stranger than that. We stood in the shallows off Cornwall, where Lyonesse slipped under without explanation, without lesson, without anyone to blame. We sat with the grief of Dwarka, the city that sank not because its people were corrupt, but because the god who had called it into being was gone, and a world cannot sustain a city like that in his absence. And we ended at Kitesh, the city that did not sink as punishment but as grace, hidden beneath a clear Russian lake, still lit, still ringing, waiting for those who come to the water with honesty in their hearts. I rolled the map up afterward and sat with it for a while. There is a quality to those stories, the sunken cities, the water cities, that I find difficult to name precisely. Melancholy, yes, but also something almost restful. The sea takes things. It has always taken things. There is grief in that, but there is also a kind of order. The section of the map I am looking at tonight has a different quality entirely. I have been circling it for some time, approaching and then drawing back. The way you approach something you know will ask something of you. The cities here are different in character from the rest of the map. The ink is somehow less certain. The cities themselves seem less fixed, as though even the cartographer was not entirely sure where to place them. Because the cities on this part of the map move. Or perhaps it is more accurate to say they were always moving, always just beyond the horizon of the last expedition, always reported to be a little further south, a little deeper into the jungle, a little further up the river. Cities that no one could reach because the cities were, in part, made of the reaching itself. There is something else about this section that made me hesitate. With the sunken cities, the darkness was the darkness of loss, of beautiful things taken by time and water. What I feel when I look at this part of the map is different, heavier somehow, more human in the worst sense of that word. Because the story I am about to tell you is not only about cities that could not be found, it is about what people did in the searching, what they destroyed, what they could not see because they were always looking for something else. I've been sitting with that for several evenings now, trying to find the right way in. And I think the right way in is the same as it always is. Not with the darkness, but with the beauty that existed before it. Not with the hunger, but with the ceremony that the hunger misread. What I want to tell you tonight is not simply a story about places. It is a story about a century, a specific, extraordinary, terrible century. And what happens when an entire civilization becomes convinced that somewhere in the world, just out of sight, there is more gold than has ever been seen. What people will do for that conviction, where it will take them, what it will cost. It is a story that begins, as so many stories begin, not with greed, but with something genuinely beautiful. A ritual, a lake, a king covered in gold, standing at the edge of still water, about to give everything away. It begins in the mountains of what we now call Colombia. And from there, it travels north through desert, south through jungle, down the length of the longest river on earth, until it has touched every corner of a continent that Europe had only just discovered existed. Come with me. The map is open. The story is waiting. High in the Andes, on a plateau in the mountains of present-day Colombia, there lived a people called the Muisca. They were not, by the measures that the 16th century would bring to their shores, a people of modest means. They farmed, they traded, they built. They had a sophisticated understanding of astronomy and of time. They worked in gold with a skill and an artistry that when the Spanish arrived and saw it, produced in those men a hunger so violent it would reshape the history of 2 continents. But the Muisca relationship with gold was not the relationship the Spanish imagined. For the Muisca, gold was not wealth. It was not currency. It was not something to be accumulated or stored or counted. Gold was sacred, specifically and precisely sacred, because it was the color of the sun, and the sun was the source of all life. And what was the color of all life belonged rightfully and necessarily to the gods, the Muisca goldsmiths. And they were extraordinary goldsmiths, working in techniques that produced objects of breathtaking delicacy, made their finest work not to be kept, but to be given away, to be offered, to be thrown into lakes and rivers and buried in the earth as gifts to the divine. More than half of everything they made went directly to the gods. This is the fact that the Spanish could not process. And I want to stay with that inability for a moment, because it is not simply a story about greed. It is a story about 2 entirely different understandings of what gold is. Understandings so far apart that they could not even recognize each other as understandings. They looked like incomprehension. They looked like deception. They looked to the Spanish like evidence that something was being hidden. For the Muisca, gold was not wealth. It was not currency. It was not a store of value, not a measure of power, not something to be accumulated and counted and protected behind walls. Gold was a material of the sacred. It was chosen for sacred purposes because of what it was, its color, its incorruptibility, its resemblance to the sun, the source of all life. You worked it into beautiful forms because beauty was the appropriate language for addressing the divine. And then you gave it away. You threw it into the lake. You buried it in the earth. You released it back to the world that had produced it, because to keep it would have been to misunderstand what it was for. This was not poverty of imagination. It was a sophisticated and coherent philosophy of material and the sacred, one that understood, with a clarity that most philosophical traditions have struggled to articulate, that the value of a thing is not in its possession, but in its circulation, that what you give away is more yours, in the deepest sense, than what you keep, that a king who begins his reign by releasing everything he carries is demonstrating something essential about what kind of king he intends to be. The Spanish brought a different understanding. For the Europeans of the 16th century, gold was the universal measure. It was what made power legible. It was what made trade possible across vast distances between peoples who shared no language and no trust. It was what funded armies, built cathedrals, elevated families from obscurity to permanence across generations. Gold was not sacred, or rather, it had a sacredness of its own, but it was the sacredness of the irreplaceable, the durable, the thing that outlasted everything else. You did not throw gold into a lake. The suggestion was almost offensive. Gold went into vaults. Gold went into crowns. Gold went into the foundations of empires. These two understandings met on the plateau of Colombia, and they could not see each other. The Spanish looked at the Muisca gold, the extraordinary work of the goldsmiths, the figures and the vessels and the ornaments, and saw wealth, saw the surface of something much larger, saw proof that somewhere behind this visible gold there was more, a treasury, a city, a place where all of this abundance was stored. The Muisca looked at the Spanish and saw people who wanted to take the offerings, who wanted to reach into the lake and pull out what had been given to the goddess, who could not understand, or would not understand, that the gold in the lake was not lost. It was exactly where it was supposed to be. No amount of translation could have crossed that distance. The word for gold was the same. The thing they were talking about was entirely different. There was no city. There was no treasury. There was only the lake. The lake was called Guatavita. It sits today in the mountains northeast of Bogota, a nearly circular body of water cupped in green hills, dark and still and clear. It is beautiful in the way that places with long memories of being sacred tend to be beautiful, quietly, without performance. You would notice it even if you did not know its history. The ceremony that would eventually become El Dorado took place on this lake. When a new leader, a new Zipa, came to power among the Muisca, he underwent a ritual of purification that lasted some time. He fasted, he abstained, he prepared himself, and then, when the preparation was complete, he was taken to the shore of Lake Guatavita. There, on a raft of reeds, surrounded by his priests and his attendants, and the accumulated offerings of his people, gold figurines, emeralds, pieces of worked metal, objects of beauty and devotion gathered from across the plateau, the new Zipa was anointed. His body was coated in clay, and then, over the clay, in gold dust, fine gold dust, blown over him until he was covered from head to foot, until he shone in the morning light like something the sun had made of itself. The raft was pushed out onto the lake. At the center of the water, the Zipa stood and threw the offerings in. All of it. The gold figures, the emeralds, the worked metal, all the beautiful things his people had made and gathered on this moment, into the lake, an offering to the goddess who lived in the water beneath, a covenant, a renewal, the new king giving everything, holding nothing back, so that his reign might begin in proper relation to the divine. And then he dove in himself. The gold washed off him into the dark water. He surfaced, plain again, himself again, clean, a king. The ceremony, by some accounts, had been performed for generations before the Spanish arrived. By other accounts, it had already ended. The Muisca had been conquered by a neighboring people before the Europeans came, and the last golden king had already made his last offering. What the Spanish saw, or heard about, or assembled from fragments of testimony, was the memory of a ritual rather than the ritual itself. It did not matter. The word spread. A king who covers himself in gold. A lake full of offerings. And somewhere behind that, surely, a city. A city to match. They called him El Dorado, the Golden One. And within a generation, the name had shifted from a person to a place, from a king to a kingdom, from a ritual of devotion to a city of streets paved in gold that lay somewhere just over the next mountain range, just beyond the next river, just a little further in. The searching began. What followed is one of the most extraordinary episodes of collective obsession in recorded history. Over the course of roughly a century, from the 1530s to the 1620s, expedition after expedition entered the South American interior, looking for a city that kept moving. That is the only way to describe what El Dorado did. It moved. Every time an expedition arrived at the place where the Golden City was supposed to be, and found only jungle and river and the evidence of their own delusion, the city simply relocated. It was always further in, always over the next ridge, always up the next river. The myth had a mechanism for this. Every expedition that returned with nothing also returned with a story, gathered from the indigenous people they had encountered, through interpreters and misunderstandings, and the particular alchemy of people who desperately want to hear a specific thing. The story was always more or less the same. Yes, such a city exists, but not here. Further, that way, past that river, over those mountains. Ask those people, not us, whether the indigenous people were telling the Spanish what they wanted to hear, to keep them moving and away, or whether genuine local traditions were being filtered through Spanish expectations into something they were not, or whether some deeper kernel of actual knowledge was being transmitted. No one can say with certainty. Perhaps all three, at different times and in different places. The expeditions themselves are a catalogue of human endurance and human suffering that is almost beyond comprehension. Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada reached the Muisca Plateau in 1537 after a march from the Caribbean coast that took 8 months and reduced his army of 800 men to fewer than 200. He found gold, real gold, the gold of Muisca craftsmen, the gold that had always been there in plain sight, but not the city. He went home. Gonzalo Pizarro, brother of Francisco, who had already destroyed the Inca Empire to the south, led 600 soldiers and 4,000 indigenous companions out of Quito in 1541, heading east into the Amazon basin in search of a country called the Land of Cinnamon, which had become entangled in the El Dorado myth. What they found was the Amazon. The jungle closed around them. The food ran out. The indigenous companions, who had not chosen to come, and had no interest in gold, died or fled or were killed. The soldiers ate their horses and their dogs and their boots. Pizarro turned back. His lieutenant, Francisco de Orellana, did not turn back. Orellana took a small group and a boat downstream to find food, and the current took him too far to return. He kept going. He sailed the entire length of the Amazon River, from its headwaters in the Andes to its mouth on the Atlantic coast, a journey of several thousand miles, becoming the first European to complete it. He saw things no European had seen. He reported, among other things, a great road and a great city along the river's banks, which may have been real, a complex civilization that the jungle has since reclaimed, or may have been the exhausted imagination of a man who had been on a boat for months and needed to have found something. He named the river for the fierce women warriors he believed he had seen on its banks, or believed he had been told about. The Amazons of Greek myth, relocated to South America by the force of a European mind that could only understand new things through old stories. He never found El Dorado. No one did. But the accounts of what lay in the interior kept changing and growing and elaborating. A lake appeared on the maps, Lake Parim, in what is now Venezuela or Guyana, and on its shores, a city called Manoa. Walter Raleigh, the English courtier and adventurer, read about Manoa and became, late in life, completely consumed by it. He sailed to Guyana in 1595 and wrote about it with a beauty and an ardor that made the legend more vivid, more compelling, more impossible to resist. He described a country of extraordinary loveliness, the hills, the rivers, the quality of the air. He had not found the city, but he had found the country, and the country was real enough to send him back. He returned in 1617, old and ill, and sent his son Wat upriver with an expedition to find what he could not go looking for himself. Wat Roland died on the Orinoco. Walter Raleigh returned to England empty-handed for the second time and was executed. Not for the failure exactly, but because the failure gave his enemies the opening they needed. He had promised gold. There was no gold. A man who had promised a king gold and delivered nothing was a man whose other enemies could now finish off. The myth consumed him as thoroughly as it consumed everyone it touched. The obsession was not contained to South America. It traveled north, crossing through Mexico, New Spain as the Spanish called it, and into the desert country beyond. The story that arrived in Mexico City in the 1530s was this. Somewhere to the north, in the desert and beyond it, there were 7 cities. 7 cities of gold, magnificent and wealthy, whose existence had been rumored for years, and whose source was, depending on who was telling the story, a Portuguese legend about 7 bishops who had fled the Moorish invasion of Spain in the 8th century, taking their treasuries with them to a legendary island called Antillia, where they had founded 7 golden cities. Whether this legend arrived in the Americas with the first Spanish colonists and attached itself to indigenous stories it only superficially resembled, or whether there was some genuine indigenous tradition underneath, is a question that has never been fully resolved. What is clear is that by the 1530s, the 7 golden cities, called Cibola, were believed to exist somewhere north of Mexico, and that belief was enough. In 1539, a Franciscan friar named Marcos de Niza was sent north to scout. He returned with a report of extraordinary promise. He had seen, from a distance, he was careful to say from a distance, a city larger than Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, a city of great buildings, a city of evident wealth. He could not enter it, he said, because his guide had been killed at its gates, but he had seen it. What Marcos de Niza had almost certainly seen was the Zuni pueblo of Hawiku, a settlement of adobe buildings in what is now New Mexico, real and inhabited and significant in its own right, but not a city of gold. The buildings caught the light. The friar, who had ridden for months through desert country and needed to have found something, saw what he needed to see. His report sent Francisco Vázquez de Coronado north in 1540 with an army of 300 Spanish soldiers and several hundred indigenous allies. Coronado was 30 years old. He had been appointed governor of a province in northwest Mexico and was ambitious and in debt, and this expedition was, in his mind, the thing that would resolve both problems. It resolved neither. He found Hawiku. He found the Zuni pueblos. He found the Hopi villages and the Rio Grande and the Grand Canyon, the first European to see it, though he regarded it as an obstacle rather than a wonder. He went further. A captive he trusted, a man he called the Turk because of something in his manner or his dress, told him of a country to the east called Quivira, where the king napped beneath trees hung with golden bells, and where the common people drank from golden jugs. Coronado followed the Turk across the Great Plains, across what is now Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, further north than any Spaniard had gone. The golden bells never appeared. The golden jugs were not there. Quivira, when they reached it, was a village of grass houses inhabited by the Wichita people, who had gold in the same quantity as everyone else Coronado had encountered, which is to say, none at all. The Turk confessed, under torture, that he had invented Quivira to lead the Spanish away from his people and their territory. He was garroted. Coronado turned south and went home. He had been gone for 2 years. He had found no gold. The expedition had cost more than it had, and would ever return. He was investigated, tried, stripped of his governorship. He spent the rest of his life in Mexico City and died there in 1554, forgotten. The 7 cities were never found, all because there were no 7 cities. There were pueblos and people and a landscape of austere and extraordinary beauty that the Spanish crossed without seeing, because they were looking for something else. Back in the south, the searching continued. The Amazon basin, which Orellana had navigated and survived, became in the following decades the site of further expeditions, each one launched on the strength of the stories the previous one had brought back. The city moved further into the jungle. It acquired new names: Manoa, Paititi, the city of the Caesars, said to lie somewhere in Patagonia, at the far southern end of the continent, founded by survivors of a shipwreck who had wandered inland and found a valley of extraordinary richness. The myth had become a family of myths, spreading through South America the way a river spreads into a delta, always moving, always finding new channels, never arriving at the sea. Paititi, in particular, has a persistence that the other names lack. It appears in indigenous Amazonian traditions, independently of the Spanish obsession, a great city in the jungle, a place of refuge and of treasure, hidden somewhere in the vast territory where Bolivia, Peru, and Brazil meet. The Spanish heard these traditions and folded them into the El Dorado myth, which was by then large enough to contain anything. But the traditions themselves may be older than the Spanish arrival, may point to something real, a city or a complex of settlements that the jungle has covered and the centuries have not yet given back. Archaeologists working in the Amazon today have found evidence of something that challenges the old assumption that the jungle was always thinly inhabited. There were cities here, large ones, connected by roads, sustained by sophisticated agriculture, home to populations that rivaled the great cities of medieval Europe. The jungle took them back when their people died, mostly of the diseases that European contact brought before European boots even arrived. And what remains is invisible from the ground, detectable only from the air, in the geometric patterns that LiDAR mapping reveals beneath the canopy. There was something in the Amazon. There may yet be things we have not found. But what the Spanish were looking for was not this, not the evidence of a sophisticated civilization, not the complexity and the achievement of the people who actually lived there. They were looking for gold, and the gold kept not being there. In 1560, a large expedition set out down the Orinoco River under the command of Pedro de Ursua. Among its members was a man named Lope de Aguirre. What happened on that river is one of the strangest and most disturbing stories the age of exploration produced. Aguirre was a soldier who had been in the Americas for 20 years, who had seen what the searching did to men, who had perhaps seen too much. On the Orinoco, something in him broke, or perhaps something that had always been there came to the surface, finding in the lawlessness of the jungle a space in which it could finally operate without constraint. He mutinied. He killed Ursua. He killed the man who replaced Ursua. He killed anyone who questioned him, or who he suspected of questioning him, or who he simply decided needed to die. He killed one of his own daughters, rather than leave her to be captured by his enemies. He declared himself independent of the Spanish crown, the first person in the Americas to do so, and signed a letter to King Philip II of Spain, addressing him as an equal and listing his grievances with a lucidity that makes the surrounding madness even more disturbing. He called himself the Wrath of God. He was caught and killed in Venezuela in 1561, less than a year after the mutiny began, but he has never quite disappeared. He is too vivid a figure, too complete an embodiment of what the search for gold did to the people who undertook it. He is what the obsession looked like when it had no more cities to chase, when the city had finally, definitively failed to appear, and what was left was only the hunger, with nothing to feed it. Werner Herzog made a film about him in 1972. Klaus Kinski played him with a quality that suggested Herzog had understood something essential, that Aguirre was not mad in the ordinary sense. He was a man who had followed a dream to its absolute end and found nothing there, and had decided, in the absence of the dream, to become the thing the dream had promised. Terrible, sovereign, answerable to nothing. The wrath of God. river that goes on forever. I want to step back from the expeditions for a moment. The story of El Dorado is usually told from the perspective of the Europeans who went looking for it. And there is something genuinely compelling in those stories. The endurance, the obsession, the extraordinary geography that was traversed in the searching, the way the myth kept shape-shifting and surviving every failure. I have been telling it that way myself, because that is where the narrative energy is. But there is another story inside this one, the story of the people who were already there. The Muisca, whose ritual started everything, had their lake drained twice. The first attempt, in the 1580s, lowered the water level enough to reveal a thin band of gold at the edges before the sides collapsed, and the project was abandoned. A second attempt, in the early 20th century, lowered it further and then silted it over into a mudflat, destroying both the access and the ecosystem. The gold at the bottom of Guatavita, the offerings of generations of Zipa, the devotion of centuries, was never recovered in any significant quantity. The lake was damaged for nothing. The people of the Zuni Pueblos, whom Coronado's army attacked when they did not produce gold, endured decades of Spanish colonization, forced labor, and cultural suppression. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680, in which the Pueblo people drove the Spanish entirely out of New Mexico for 12 years, the most successful indigenous uprising against European colonization in North American history, was the consequence of what the gold hunting had set in motion. And the Amazon. The Amazon is the hardest to speak about directly, because the scale of what happened there is simply too large for ordinary language. The diseases that arrived with or ahead of the Europeans, smallpox, measles, influenza, against which the indigenous population had no immunity, moved faster than any expedition. They moved through trade networks, through river systems, through the ordinary human connections that linked communities across the continent. Populations that had never seen a European died of European diseases before Europeans arrived. The civilizations that left the geometric patterns in the Amazon earth, the cities that LIDAR now reveals beneath the canopy, were not destroyed by the Spanish directly. They were hollowed out by the diseases that preceded the conquest, and the jungle moved in while the people were dying. And by the time the boots arrived, there was already almost no one left to tell what had been there. The gold they were looking for was the offering at the center of a ceremony of devotion. It was already in the lake. It had always been in the lake. There was no city. There was never a city. What there was, what was actually there, in the mountains and the jungles and the plateaus and the plains, was extraordinary. Not gold in the European sense, not a treasury or a city or a hoard waiting to be claimed, but civilizations of genuine complexity and depth. Peoples who had developed, over centuries, sophisticated understandings of agriculture, of astronomy, of architecture, of the sacred. The Muisca, with their philosophy of gold as devotion rather than wealth. The Pueblo people, with their multi-story cities of adobe. Their intricate relationship with a desert landscape that Europeans could only see as barren. The Amazon civilizations, whose scale and sophistication we are only now beginning to understand, whose cities and roads and agricultural systems lay hidden beneath the jungle canopy for 500 years before the right instruments finally revealed them. All of it was there, visible, present, alive. And the expeditions walked through it, or sailed past it, or marched across it, without seeing it. Not because it was hidden, but because they were looking for something else. Because their eyes were trained on a city that did not exist, a gold that was always just over the next ridge, and everything that was actually in front of them registered only as obstacle or irrelevance, or, at worst, as something to be swept aside on the way to the destination. And even the gold that was there, the real gold, the Muisca gold, the gold of craftsmen who had spent generations working out how to speak to the divine in metal. They could not see that either. They saw objects. They saw weight and purity and market value. They did not see devotion. They did not see centuries of a people working out, in gold and in ceremony, their understanding of the proper relationship between the human and the divine. They did not see a philosophy. They saw a commodity. They were so entirely inside their own understanding of what gold meant that another understanding of it was simply not available to them. The Muisca were not hiding the city. There was no city to hide. There was only the lake and the ceremony, and a people who had long ago worked out that the most important thing you can do with something precious is give it away. The Spanish could not have understood that, not because they were uniquely cruel or uniquely blind, though cruelty there was in abundance, but because their entire world was organized around a different answer to the question of what gold is for. And when two worlds meet across that kind of difference, the world with the army tends to decide what the answer is. In 1969, in a cave near Bogota, two men found something. They had been exploring, not archaeologists, simply people curious about a cave. And in the cave, they found a ceramic vessel, sealed. Inside the vessel was a small object wrapped in cloth. They unwrapped it carefully, not knowing what they had. It was a raft, made of gold, 10 centimeters long, flat-bottomed, with figures standing on it, a central figure, taller than the others, and around him a ring of attendants, and at the corners of the raft, upright poles. The workmanship was extraordinary. Each figure was distinct. The central figure's posture, upright, arms slightly extended, the posture of someone about to offer something, was unmistakable. It was a model of the ceremony. Someone, at some point before the Spanish arrived or during the period of the conquest, had made a gold model of the ritual that had started everything. A Muisca goldsmith had made it, using the lost wax technique, carving the form in wax, encasing it in clay, melting the wax out and pouring liquid gold in, and had placed it in a cave, perhaps as an offering, perhaps as a record, perhaps as both. The Muisca raft is now in the Gold Museum in Bogota, the Museo del Oro, where it has become one of Colombia's most important national symbols. It appears on coins and stamps and official materials. It is kept in a room of its own, displayed with great care. It is, as I said, 10 centimeters long. 10 centimeters. The thing that sent Walter Raleigh to his death, that drove Aguirre to the edge of the world and over it, that consumed a century of European imagination and caused the deaths of people beyond counting. The real thing, the actual thing, the object at the origin of everything, is 10 centimeters long and sits in a glass case in Bogota. And people come to look at it every day. I find this The smallness of it, the intimacy of it, the extraordinary survival of it. Almost too much to hold. All that searching, all that destruction, all that distance covered by men who would kill anything that stood between them and the gold city that did not exist. And the truth of it is here, in a glass case, made by a craftsman who understood what gold was for. The golden king on his raft, about to offer everything to the water. It was always a story about devotion. The Spanish turned it into a story about greed. But the original story, the one the Muisca were telling with the ceremony, the one the unknown goldsmith was telling with the raft, was about the proper relationship between what we have and what is sacred, about the king who begins his reign by giving everything away, about gold going into the lake, not because the lake is a treasury, but because the lake is a god, and the god deserves everything. And the king who understands this is ready to rule. That story survived. The raft survived. The lake is still there, in its green hills northeast of Bogota, dark and still and clear. The offerings are still at the bottom of it, somewhere in the silt beneath the cold water, and the gold figures, and the emeralds, and the worked metal of generations of Zipa, given freely, not lost exactly, just returned to where they were always meant to be. I am rolling the map up. This section feels different in my hands from the other one. Heavier, perhaps. Or simply different. The cities in this part of the map are not marked in the same ink as the sunken cities. They are hazier, more like suggestions than assertions, as though even the cartographer was not entirely sure they were there. Perhaps that is appropriate. El Dorado was always a suggestion, a rumor, a ceremony seen from a distance, misunderstood, and then elaborated by a century of longing into something that the original ceremony would not have recognized as itself. What stays with me after every time I look at this section of the map is not the expeditions. It is not Coronado in Kansas, standing in a field of grass, looking at the wrong thing. It is not Aguirre on the river, becoming the thing that the search had made of him. It is not even Raleigh, old and ill on the shore of Trinidad, waiting for news that would not come. What stays with me is the raft. 10 centimeters of gold. A king about to give everything away. The moment before the offering, held in metal, preserved in a cave for centuries, waiting to be found. There is something in that image that I keep returning to. The idea that the real treasure was always the ceremony. That the gold was never the point. That the point was the giving, the opening of the hands, the releasing of the thing you have been holding, the moment when what was yours becomes the water's. I think about that when I look at the map, all that searching, and the answer was always there, in the place they started from, in a ritual performed on a lake in the mountains of Colombia, by a people who understood that gold was not wealth, that it was never wealth, but a language, a way of speaking to something larger than yourself. And that the correct thing to do with a language like that is not to hoard it, but to use it, to give it away, to let it go into the water, where it was always meant to go. Let the map rest now. Let the cities settle, wherever they are, wherever they always were, in the silt of the lake, or the grass of the plains, or the green darkness of the jungle canopy. Let the river run. The Amazon is still there, longer than any other river on earth. still carrying its water from the Andes to the Atlantic, still moving through a country that no expedition ever fully mapped or understood. The jungle grows back, slowly, over the things that were built and lost. The geometric patterns lie beneath the canopy, waiting for the right light, the right instrument, the right question. And in Bogota, in a glass case in the Gold Museum, the small king stands on his small raft with his arms slightly extended, about to offer everything to the water. He has been standing there for a very long time. He is very patient. Let your breath slow now. Let the weight of the story settle into you. And then, gently, begin to lift. Let the jungle go dark. Let the river go quiet. Let the mountains hold the lake the way they have always held it. Without effort, without question. Simply because that is what mountains do. You are warm. You are still. The gold is in the lake. Sleep now. Sleep.